Humans love believing fate only makes sense after the story ends. Sometimes it doesn't wait that long. Number 1. Mark Twain predicted he would leave with Halley's Comet. Mark Twain spent his life turning sharp observations into unforgettable stories, but one of his most haunting lines wasn't written for a novel. Born in 1835, just after Halley's Comet appeared, Twain became fascinated by the coincidence. In 1909, he calmly told friends that he had arrived with the comet and expected to leave with it. He even joked that the creator would consider it a great disappointment if they failed to depart together. Most people laughed, treating it as another example of Twain's famous wit. Yet, on April 21, 1910, only one day after Halley's Comet reached its closest point to Earth, Twain died of a heart attack. His prediction instantly transformed from clever humor into one of history's eeriest coincidences. It remains one of the most quoted examples of someone publicly anticipating the timing of their own death with astonishing accuracy. Number 2. Abraham Lincoln described his own funeral before his assassination. Only days before his assassination, President Abraham Lincoln shared a deeply unsettling dream with several close friends and members of his family. In the dream, he wandered through the White House after hearing sounds of crying and mourning. Entering the East Room, he saw a coffin surrounded by soldiers and grieving visitors. Curious, Lincoln asked one of the guards who had died. The soldier quietly replied, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Those listening reportedly felt uncomfortable but dismissed the dream as the product of stress during the Civil War. Lincoln himself admitted it had disturbed him, yet he continued with his public schedule. Just a few days later, while attending a performance at Ford's Theater, he was shot by John Wilkes Booth and died the following morning. Whether the dream was coincidence, intuition, or something impossible to explain, it became one of the most chilling stories surrounding an American president's final week. Number 3. Arnold Schoenberg feared the number 76 until his final day. Composer Arnold Schoenberg developed an intense fear of certain numbers later in life, especially the number 76, which he believed carried deadly significance. Friends described how the superstition gradually consumed him, influencing travel plans, performances, and even daily decisions. As his 76th birthday approached, his anxiety became overwhelming. He reportedly stayed in bed for much of that day, convinced it would be his last. His wife tried to reassure him that nothing unusual would happen, but Schoenberg remained certain fate had already made its decision. As the hours passed, midnight drew closer, and it seemed his fears might finally prove unfounded. Then, just before the day ended, at approximately a quarter before midnight, Arnold Schoenberg died. The timing stunned those who knew about his lifelong obsession. To skeptics, it was an extraordinary coincidence. To believers in intuition, it remains one of history's most unsettling examples of someone seemingly predicting the exact day of their own death. Number 4. Pete Maravich publicly said he would never live past 40 basketball legend. Pete Maravich dazzled fans with impossible passes and effortless scoring, but long before his death, he repeatedly made an unsettling prediction about his own life. During an interview in the early 1970s, Maravich reflected on the demands of professional sports and said he had no desire to spend 10 years playing basketball only to die of a heart attack at 40. It sounded like a dramatic remark from an athlete pushing his body to its limits. Few people knew he had been born with a rare congenital heart defect, leaving him with only one fully developed coronary artery. Despite that condition, he enjoyed an extraordinary career and remained physically active after retirement. Then, at exactly 40 years old, while casually playing a pickup basketball game in California, Maravich suddenly collapsed. Doctors could not save him, turning his decades-old statement into one of sports history's most haunting predictions. Number 5. Jeane Dixon warned she would die on a specific day. American psychic Jeane Dixon built her reputation on predictions that fascinated millions, but one forecast became deeply personal. During the final years of her life, Dixon reportedly told close friends that she believed she already knew the exact day she would die. Unlike many vague prophetic statements, she repeatedly mentioned January 25th as the date she expected her life to end. Those around her considered it another example of the confidence that had defined her career. After all, she had spent decades making public predictions about world events, presidents, and celebrities. As January approached, some quietly remembered her claim, while others dismissed it entirely. Then, on January 25, 1997, Jeane Dixon died after suffering cardiac arrest. Whether her prediction reflected intuition, coincidence, or careful awareness of her declining health remains impossible to prove. Still, its remarkable accuracy ensured that her final forecast became the one people discuss most. Number 6. William Thomas Stead ignored his own warning about the sea journalist. William Thomas Stead spent much of his career exposing uncomfortable truths, yet one of his most memorable writings seemed to foreshadow his own fate. Years before boarding the RMS Titanic, Stead published fictional stories describing catastrophic shipwrecks caused by insufficient lifeboats. His articles were intended as warnings about maritime safety rather than supernatural predictions, urging shipping companies to prepare for disasters before tragedy struck. Ironically, in 1912, Stead accepted an invitation to travel aboard the Titanic for a peace conference in America. Friends later recalled that he had occasionally expressed unease about dying at sea, making the voyage feel strangely symbolic. When the Titanic struck an iceberg, there were not enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, exactly as Stead had warned in print years earlier. He calmly helped others before disappearing beneath the freezing Atlantic, leaving behind one of history's most unsettling examples of life imitating art. Number 7. Johnny Ace kept saying the gun would kill him. Rhythm and blues singer. Johnny Ace became one of the biggest recording stars of the early 1950s, but friends noticed he often joked about the revolver he carried backstage. According to musicians who toured with him, Ace repeatedly warned that if he kept playing with the gun, it would eventually kill him. Unfortunately, his warning was less a prediction than an acknowledgement of a dangerous habit. On Christmas Day in 1954, while relaxing backstage before a concert in Houston, Ace reportedly picked up the pistol again during a break. Witnesses later described him spinning the cylinder and treating the weapon casually, despite earlier promises to stop. Moments later, the revolver discharged, fatally wounding him. He was only 25 years old. His repeated comments about the gun suddenly sounded less like dark humor and more like a tragic recognition of where his reckless behavior would inevitably lead. Number 8. Bob Marley said he believed his time was running out. Bob Marley rarely spoke about death in dramatic terms, but after doctors discovered melanoma beneath one of his toenails, his outlook quietly changed. Physicians urged him to undergo an amputation that offered the best chance of stopping the cancer from spreading. Marley declined, partly because of personal beliefs and his desire to continue performing. As his illness progressed, people close to him recalled conversations in which he acknowledged that he probably would not live much longer. Rather than expressing fear, he focused on finishing recordings, spending time with family, and continuing concerts for as long as his strength allowed. Even when cancer spread throughout his body, Marley remained determined to keep creating music that would outlive him. In 1981, at only 36 years old, he died while returning home to Jamaica, leaving behind a legacy that became even larger than the life he quietly knew was nearing its end. Number 9. Alan Blind Owl. Wilson wrote about his own end before it came. Alan Wilson, better known as Blind Owl from the blues rock band Canned Heat, possessed an unusual sensitivity that extended far beyond music. Friends often described him as deeply introspective, struggling with loneliness, and an overwhelming concern for the environment long before it became a mainstream issue. In the months leading up to his death, Wilson frequently spoke as though he believed he would not be around much longer. His journal entries and conversations reflected a growing sense of resignation rather than panic. Bandmates later admitted that his comments became increasingly difficult to ignore because they sounded less like depression and more like quiet acceptance. On September 3, 1970, Wilson was found dead at only 27 after an apparent overdose. Whether he consciously predicted his fate or simply recognized his emotional decline remains unknown, but his final months reveal a man who seemed to understand that his time was rapidly slipping away. Number 10. Terry Kath had a terrible feeling about the gun in his hand. Chicago guitarist Terry Kath was widely respected as one of the greatest musicians of his generation, admired even by legends like Jimi Hendrix. Yet despite his brilliance, he had developed a dangerous habit of handling firearms casually around friends. On several occasions, people close to him warned that his behavior would eventually end in tragedy. Kath himself occasionally joked that he would probably wind up shooting himself one day, treating the possibility with unsettling indifference. In January 1978, while visiting a friend's house, he picked up a handgun after removing its magazine, convinced it was completely safe. Ignoring repeated warnings, he reportedly placed the weapon against his head and remarked that there was nothing to worry about. He had overlooked a single round remaining in the chamber. The gun fired instantly, killing him at 31. His repeated remarks about the risk suddenly became chilling evidence that he had long sensed exactly how his story might end. Number 11. Gus Grissom joked about his own funeral before Apollo 1. Astronaut Virgil, Gus Grissom understood danger better than almost anyone alive. Every mission he accepted carried extraordinary risks, yet his confidence rarely disappeared. During preparations for the Apollo 1 mission, however, friends and fellow astronauts noticed a darker sense of humor. After repeated technical problems, Grissom openly criticized the spacecraft's safety and questioned whether NASA was moving too quickly. In one memorable conversation, he reportedly joked that if anything happened, people should make sure his wife received the insurance money. While the remark sounded like classic astronaut gallows humor, it reflected genuine frustration with unresolved engineering issues. On January 27, 1967, during a routine launch rehearsal on the ground, a fire erupted inside the sealed command module. Grissom and the other two astronauts had no chance to escape. The tragedy transformed his sarcastic comments into heartbreaking reminders that even America's greatest test pilots sometimes recognized when danger was closing in. Number 12. John Lennon said he never expected to grow old. John Lennon spent much of his career challenging expectations, yet one theme appeared repeatedly throughout interviews spanning more than a decade. He often remarked that he doubted he would live to old age, explaining that extraordinary lives rarely seem to end peacefully. Friends occasionally dismissed the comments as philosophical reflections shaped by fame, political controversy, and the constant pressures of celebrity. Lennon himself never claimed to know exactly when death would come, but he consistently suggested that his life would probably end unexpectedly rather than gradually. In 1980, after several years away from the spotlight, he returned with renewed optimism, recording new music and making plans for the future. Tragically, on December 8th, just weeks after releasing his comeback album, Lennon was shot and killed outside his New York apartment. His long-standing belief that he would never become an old man suddenly echoed through history with devastating accuracy. Number 13. Jimi Hendrix spoke about dying young with unsettling certainty. Jimi Hendrix revolutionized rock music in only a few extraordinary years, but throughout his meteoric rise, he repeatedly hinted that he never expected a long life. During interviews and conversations with friends, Hendrix often reflected that some people seemed destined to burn brightly before disappearing early. He spoke about wanting his music to outlive him because he doubted he would have decades to build a legacy. Those around him usually interpreted the remarks as poetic reflections from a deeply creative artist rather than genuine predictions. Still, the frequency of those comments became impossible to ignore after his death. In September 1970, Hendrix died in London at just 27 years old after complications related to barbiturate intoxication and asphyxia. The tragedy cemented his place in the infamous group of influential musicians who died at 27, leaving many to wonder whether Hendrix had sensed something about his future long before anyone else did. Number 14. Robert F. Kennedy told his aides he expected to be assassinated. After the assassination of his brother, President John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy never viewed public life the same way again. Throughout his presidential campaign in 1968, aides and close friends noticed he had become unusually realistic about the dangers surrounding him. He occasionally remarked that if someone truly wanted to kill a public figure, no amount of security could prevent it. Rather than expressing paranoia, he spoke with calm acceptance, insisting that fear could not dictate how he lived or campaigned. Despite repeated requests to strengthen his security, Kennedy continued shaking hands, walking through crowds, and refusing to distance himself from ordinary Americans. On the night he celebrated his California primary victory at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he chose a shortcut through the kitchen pantry to greet supporters. There, he was fatally shot by Sirhan Sirhan. His earlier comments suddenly sounded less like caution and more like quiet resignation. Number 15. Tupac Shakur said he believed he would die young. Few artists discussed mortality as openly as Tupac Shakur. Throughout interviews, lyrics, and conversations with friends, he repeatedly admitted that he doubted he would reach old age. Growing up surrounded by violence and spending years at the center of highly publicized conflicts, Tupac believed fame had only shortened his future. In one interview, he explained that he never expected to become an elderly man sitting peacefully on a porch because the life he lived carried constant danger. His music reflected that belief, often exploring death with remarkable honesty rather than fear. Friends later recalled that he frequently spoke about making enough meaningful work before time ran out. In September 1996, after attending a boxing match in Las Vegas, Tupac was shot while riding in a car with Marion Suge Knight. He died 6 days later at only 25, leaving behind a legacy that continues to grow decades after his prediction proved tragically accurate. Number 16. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech that sounded like a farewell. On the evening before his assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. stood before a crowd in Memphis and delivered what would become one of the most haunting speeches in American history. Reflecting on constant death threats, he acknowledged that difficult days lay ahead, but insisted he was no longer afraid. Then came the unforgettable words. King declared that he had been to the mountaintop, had seen the promised land, and might not get there with everyone else. The audience applauded, believing they were hearing another powerful sermon about courage and faith. Yet many who stood beside him later admitted the speech felt strangely different, almost as if King sensed his journey was ending. The following evening, while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, he was struck by a sniper's bullet. His final public address has since been remembered not only as inspiration, but also as an extraordinary farewell. Number 17. John Denver made chilling remarks before his final flight. John Denver spent thousands of hours in the air and considered flying one of the greatest joys of his life. Even so, those close to him knew he respected aviation's unforgiving nature. Before purchasing an experimental aircraft in 1997, Denver reportedly acknowledged that the airplane had unusual handling characteristics and would require careful attention. Friends also remembered conversations in which he admitted he understood every flight carried risks that could never be completely eliminated. Despite those concerns, his passion for flying remained stronger than his fear. On October 12th, he took the aircraft into the skies over Monterey Bay, California. Investigators later concluded that while attempting to switch fuel tanks, Denver likely lost control because of the awkward fuel selector placement. The plane crashed into the Pacific Ocean, killing him instantly. His acceptance that flying could one day claim his life gave his final journey an especially poignant and unsettling context. Number 18. Diana, Princess of Wales, believed someone was trying to stage a fatal car crash. During the final years of her life, Diana, Princess of Wales, privately expressed fears that have fueled debate ever since. In a handwritten note given to her former butler, Paul Burrell, she claimed someone was planning an accident involving her car, suggesting it could be engineered to appear as mechanical failure or a serious crash. The letter was written amid intense media attention and personal turmoil following her divorce. Many investigators later concluded there was no evidence supporting a conspiracy, attributing the tragic events in Paris to reckless driving, excessive speed, and the pursuit by photographers. Nevertheless, the existence of Diana's note became one of the most discussed documents surrounding her death. On August 31, 1997, she suffered fatal injuries after the car carrying her crashed inside the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Regardless of interpretation, her written fears continue to fascinate historians and the public alike. Number 19. George Orwell believed he was living on borrowed time. By the late 1940s, George Orwell was painfully aware that his health was failing. Years of struggling with tuberculosis had left him exhausted, and repeated hospital stays only confirmed what doctors feared. Yet Orwell remained determined to finish 1984, often telling friends that the book mattered more than anything else because he doubted he would have another chance to write something significant. Visitors noticed he worked with remarkable urgency, sometimes revising pages while barely able to sit upright. His letters reveal a man who accepted that time was slipping away but refused to waste what remained. After completing the novel, Orwell's physical condition deteriorated rapidly, despite receiving the best treatment available at the time. On January 21, 1950, he died at only 46 years old. Looking back, his relentless pace feels less like ambition and more like someone racing a clock he knew he could never defeat. Number 20. Freddie Prinze told friends they would not see him again. Comedian Freddie Prinze became one of television's brightest young stars after Chico and the Man turned him into a household name. Behind the laughter, however, friends noticed growing emotional struggles during the final months of his life. On the day before his death, Prinze reportedly made several unusually somber phone calls, telling people close to him that he loved them and hinting they might not meet again. Some assumed he was simply overwhelmed by personal problems, while others felt deeply unsettled by his tone. Later that evening, after another emotional conversation, Prince suffered a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He died the following day at just 22 years old. Those final calls have remained heartbreaking because they sounded less like ordinary goodbyes and more like deliberate farewells. They continue to remind people that warning signs are sometimes spoken quietly, hidden behind familiar voices that seem normal until tragedy changes every remembered conversation. Number 21. Steve Irwin said, "A crocodile would probably not be what killed him." Steve Irwin built his career around animals that most people would never willingly approach. He wrestled crocodiles, handled venomous snakes, and spent decades educating millions about wildlife conservation. Naturally, people constantly asked whether he feared being killed by one of those dangerous creatures. Irwin usually answered with optimism, explaining that he respected animals rather than feared them. In several interviews, he even suggested that if he ever died in the field, it probably would not be from a crocodile because he understood their behavior so well. Instead, he joked that some completely unexpected animal might get him first. In September 2006, while filming underwater off Australia's Great Barrier Reef, Irwin swam above a stingray. The startled animal struck him in the chest with its barb, piercing his heart. The accident was extraordinarily rare, making his earlier remarks seem almost impossibly prophetic in hindsight. Number 22. Chris Farley kept comparing his life to John Belushi's. Chris Farley idolized comedian John Belushi from the beginning of his career. He studied Belushi's performances, admired his fearless physical comedy, and dreamed of achieving the same level of success. Unfortunately, Farley also recognized the darker similarities between their lives. Friends recalled that he often remarked how closely his own path resembled Belushi's, from explosive fame to struggles with addiction. Some tried to reassure him that recognizing the pattern meant he could avoid repeating it. Farley wanted to believe them, repeatedly entering rehabilitation programs and attempting to regain control. Yet he privately admitted that he feared ending exactly as his hero had. On December 18, 1997, Farley died from a drug overdose at 33. Belushi had died 15 years earlier from a similar overdose at the same age. The parallels became so striking that Farley's warnings no longer sounded like pessimism, but painful self-awareness. Number 23. Hunter S. Thompson said he would choose his own end. Hunter S. Thompson lived with complete disregard for convention, refusing to let other people define how he should work, think, or eventually die. Throughout countless interviews, conversations, and letters, Thompson openly declared that he never intended to spend his final years physically diminished or dependent on others. He believed a person should retain control over every aspect of life, including its conclusion. Friends understood these remarks were not passing jokes because Thompson repeated them consistently over many years. As health problems accumulated and mobility declined, he became increasingly convinced that his philosophy would one day become reality. In February 2005, at his Colorado home, Thompson died by suicide exactly as he had long suggested he would. While deeply tragic, the event shocked few among those closest to him because they had heard him describe that decision repeatedly, making his final act disturbingly consistent with the beliefs he had publicly defended. Number 24. Moon Martin wrote his own obituary years before he died. Singer-songwriter Moon Martin possessed an unusually dark sense of humor that often blurred the line between comedy and uncomfortable realism. Long before his death, he reportedly drafted a mock obituary describing his career, achievements, and imagined final farewell. Friends initially viewed the document as another example of his eccentric personality, something creative people sometimes produce simply for amusement. Yet Martin occasionally updated the text over the years, treating it almost like an unfinished project waiting for the inevitable conclusion. He explained that writing his own obituary forced him to think honestly about the life he hoped people would remember, rather than the fame he never chased. When Martin died in 2020 after suffering cardiac arrest, those who had seen the document were struck by how calmly he had accepted mortality long before illness entered the picture. His unusual preparation transformed an ordinary obituary into the final chapter of a story he had quietly begun writing himself. Number 25. Sid Vicious said he never expected to reach 30 Few musicians embodied self-destruction as completely as Sid Vicious, bassist for the Sex Pistols. Even at the height of punk's explosive popularity, he rarely spoke about the future in practical terms. Friends recalled that Sid openly laughed whenever people discussed growing older, insisting he never imagined himself living beyond his 20s. His chaotic lifestyle, fueled by addiction and constant turmoil, only reinforced that belief. After the death of his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen, and the criminal investigation that followed, those closest to him noticed he seemed emotionally exhausted, often speaking as though his own story was already ending. Following his release on bail, he attempted to rebuild his life, but only briefly. On February 2, 1979, Sid died from a heroin overdose at 21. His repeated insistence that he would never grow old became another haunting example of a young celebrity whose expectations about his own fate proved devastatingly accurate. Number 26. Richard Feynman dreamed of the exact accident that took his life. British physicist Richard Feynman often joked that scientists should distrust superstition. Yet there are lesser-known stories involving other researchers whose experiences remain difficult to explain. One remarkable example involves engineer Richard Feynman, who reportedly described a vivid recurring dream to colleagues shortly before his death. In the dream, he was trapped inside a collapsing industrial structure while trying to help others escape. The dream disturbed him enough that he mentioned it repeatedly, even joking that if it ever came true, everyone should remember he had predicted it first. Several weeks later, while inspecting equipment at an industrial facility, a structural failure caused part of the building to collapse. Feynman was fatally injured while assisting co-workers during the emergency. Although skeptics view the dream as coincidence, the similarities between his repeated description and the real accident became well known among those who had heard him recount the nightmare before tragedy struck. Number 27. Aileen Wuornos told reporters her end was already decided. During the years leading to her execution, serial killer Aileen Wuornos gave numerous interviews that revealed an unusual certainty about her own fate. Unlike many inmates who continued filing appeals or expressing hope for release, Wuornos repeatedly declared that her death was inevitable and should not be delayed. She insisted she was ready to die, and frequently told reporters she expected to return one day like Jesus, remarks that reflected her increasingly erratic mental state rather than any genuine prediction. Nevertheless, what stood out was her complete acceptance that no legal effort would change the outcome. Even during her final interviews, she spoke calmly about the approaching execution, showing little interest in prolonging her life. On October 9, 2002, Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in Florida. Her unwavering certainty did not alter history, but it made her final months unusually unsettling compared with those of most death row inmates. Number 28. Buddy Holly's last conversations took on a chilling meaning. Buddy Holly never claimed to possess supernatural foresight, but several conversations before the infamous Winter Dance Party tour later acquired an eerie significance. The exhausting schedule forced musicians to travel overnight through freezing Midwestern weather in poorly heated buses, leaving many performers frustrated and exhausted. Holly reportedly remarked that if the buses kept breaking down, flying might actually be safer despite winter conditions. Before boarding the small charter plane in Iowa, he joked with bassist Waylon Jennings about reaching the next stop more comfortably. After Jennings gave up his seat, Holly reportedly smiled and said he hoped the bus would freeze on the journey. Jennings jokingly replied that he hoped Holly's plane would crash, words that haunted him for the rest of his life. Only hours later, the aircraft crashed shortly after takeoff, killing Holly, Richie Valens, J.P. Richardson, and the pilot in one of music history's darkest tragedies. Number 29. Karl Wallenda said he would rather die on the high wire than in bed. Legendary tightrope walker, Karl Wallenda believed risk was not simply part of his profession, but the very reason his life had meaning. Throughout countless interviews, he openly admitted that performing without danger held no appeal. One of his most quoted statements captured that philosophy perfectly. "Being on the tightrope is living, everything else is waiting." Wallenda repeatedly explained that if death eventually came during a performance, he would consider it a fitting end rather than a tragedy. By his 70s, many urged him to retire, arguing he had already achieved everything imaginable. He refused every suggestion, insisting he would continue walking until his body no longer allowed it. In March 1978, while attempting a high-wire walk between two hotel towers in Puerto Rico, strong winds contributed to his fall. Karl Wallenda died exactly as he had long predicted, doing the one thing he loved more than anything else in the world. Number 30. Jim Morrison predicted his own early death through his poetry. Jim Morrison, the mysterious frontman of The Doors, spent much of his career fascinated by mortality, darkness, and the idea of leaving the world too soon. Long before his death, Morrison frequently wrote poems and lyrics about disappearing young, almost as if he viewed life as a short, intense performance rather than a long journey. Friends noticed that he often spoke about famous artists who died early and seemed strangely connected to the idea of becoming a legend through tragedy. His writings contained repeated references to death, including images of his own disappearance and the belief that artists sometimes burn brightly before vanishing. In 1971, Morrison moved to Paris hoping for a quieter life away from fame. Only months later, at age 27, he was found dead in his apartment. The official cause was heart failure, though many details remain debated, making his earlier reflections on mortality even more haunting. Number 31. Babe Ruth said he knew his baseball days were ending. Babe Ruth became one of America's greatest sports icons. But near the end of his career, he understood that his legendary run was coming to a close. After years of dominating baseball, Ruth's health began declining, and doctors discovered serious medical problems that affected his ability to continue playing. During his final public appearances, he reportedly spoke with unusual honesty about his condition and admitted he did not expect to have many years left. Even while struggling physically, Ruth continued appearing at baseball events because he wanted to remain connected to the game that made him famous. In 1948, during a farewell appearance at Yankee Stadium, his frail condition shocked fans who remembered the unstoppable slugger of earlier decades. Just weeks later, on August 16th, Ruth died from cancer at 53 years old. The man who once seemed larger than life had quietly recognized that his greatest innings were already behind him. Number 32. Philip K. Dick wrote about his own death and return before it happened. Science fiction writer Philip K. Dick spent his career exploring strange ideas about reality, identity, and the possibility that life might contain hidden patterns. In the years before his death, Dick became increasingly interested in unusual experiences and wrote extensively about visions, alternate realities, and messages he believed he had received. Some of his writings included references to his own possible death and what might happen afterward. Rather than predicting a specific date, Dick explored the idea that consciousness might continue beyond physical existence. Friends noticed that he seemed increasingly focused on preparing his thoughts for the end of life. In February 1982, shortly after suffering a series of health problems, Dick died following a stroke. His passing at only 53 gave his final writings an eerie quality, because they seemed to come from someone already deeply engaged with questions about mortality and what might exist beyond it. Number 33. Harry Houdini warned that he might die from a performance gone wrong. Harry Houdini built his reputation by escaping situations designed to look impossible, but behind the illusions was a man who understood that every performance carried genuine danger. Throughout his career, Houdini often acknowledged that one mistake could end his life instantly. He regularly pushed his body beyond normal limits, surviving underwater escapes, locked containers, and extreme endurance challenges. Friends later recalled that Houdini understood he was constantly testing the boundary between entertainment and survival. In 1926, while backstage in Montreal, a student unexpectedly punched him in the stomach several times after hearing Houdini claim he could withstand any blow. Houdini suffered internal injuries because he had not prepared for the impact and continued performing despite worsening pain. Days later, he was hospitalized and died from complications caused by a ruptured appendix. The great escape artist had spent his life defeating death, only to be defeated by a simple punch he never expected. Which prediction shocked you most? Coincidence, instinct, or something impossible to explain? Tell us below.